August 14, 1945. Manchuria. Lieutenant Daniel Harper felt the B-29 Superfortress shudder violently as anti-aircraft fire tore through the fuselage. The radioman station erupted in sparks and smoke. Through his headset, he heard the pilot's strained voice ordering bailout. Harper's hands moved on instinct, grabbing his parachute pack, his survival kit, his sidearm. The aircraft was dying. They all knew it. The mission to strike Japanese military installations in occupied Manchuria had gone catastrophically wrong. Now, as the bomber spiraled toward the earth, Harper faced a terror worse than the fall itself. He was about to land in territory controlled by Japanese forces notorious for their treatment of captured American airmen. Beheading, torture, immediate execution. These weren't rumors. They were documented facts that every B-29 crew member knew before crossing into enemy airspace. Harper pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk that knocked the wind from his lungs. Below him, the Manchurian countryside spread out in a patchwork of brown fields and scattered villages. Somewhere down there, his crewmates were descending. Somewhere down there, Japanese soldiers were already mobilizing to hunt them. Harper had no way of knowing that his parachute was drifting toward a small farming community that would defy everything he understood about survival behind enemy lines. He had no way of knowing that a family of Chinese farmers would risk annihilation to protect him. And he certainly had no way of knowing that his life would be saved not by military strategy or Allied advancement, but by a debt of honor stretching back a decade to an American missionary he'd never met. The ground rushed up. Harper hit hard, rolled, and immediately began gathering his parachute. His training kicked in: hide the chute, find cover, evade capture, move at night, the standard protocol for downed airmen. But as he stuffed the silk canopy behind a cluster of rocks, Harper heard voices. Chinese voices, not Japanese, not yet. He froze, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. 3 figures emerged from the nearby sorghum field. An older man, weathered and thin, wearing the simple clothes of a farmer. A woman, perhaps his wife, her face lined with years of hardship. And a younger man, maybe 20, with the same gaunt features that spoke of chronic hunger. They stopped when they saw Harper. For a long moment nobody moved. Harper's finger rested on the trigger guard. The farmer raised both hands slowly, palms out. No weapon, no threat. The old man spoke rapidly in Chinese, gesturing toward the horizon where smoke from Harper's crashed B-29 rose in a black column. Then he pointed at Harper and made a cutting motion across his throat. The message was clear. Japanese soldiers were coming. They would kill him. The woman stepped forward, urgency in her movements. She grabbed Harper's arm with surprising strength and pulled. The younger man began kicking dirt over the parachute marks. The old farmer gestured frantically toward their village. Harper had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. Trust these strangers or run. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap. Chinese civilians in Japanese-occupied territory had every reason to turn him in. Collaboration meant survival. Harboring an American airman meant execution for entire families. The Japanese had made that policy brutally clear throughout their occupation, but something in the woman's eyes stopped Harper from running. Desperation. Not for herself, for him. He nodded. They moved fast. The 3 Chinese civilians led Harper through the sorghum field, keeping low, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to hide from occupying forces. Behind them, Harper heard the distant sound of truck engines. Japanese patrols. The search had begun. The village was small, maybe 15 structures, mud brick homes with thatched roofs, narrow dirt paths between buildings, chickens scattered as they ran past. The old farmer led Harper to a modest compound. Inside the courtyard, the man moved to what looked like a grain storage area. He and his son began frantically moving aside heavy clay pots and woven baskets. Beneath, Harper saw a wooden trapdoor. The farmer pulled it open, revealing a pit dug into the earth, maybe 6 feet deep, 4 feet wide, darkness below. The woman thrust a cloth bundle into Harper's hands. Food, water. The old man pointed down into the pit, then put his finger to his lips. Silence. Absolute silence. Harper understood. This was where he would hide. This earthen hole would be his cell, his shelter, his tomb if the Japanese discovered him. He climbed down. The space was barely large enough to sit. The smell of stored grain filled his nostrils. Above, the family quickly replaced the trapdoor and began moving the storage containers back into position. Then Harper heard them scatter grain across the floor, disguising any evidence of disturbance. Darkness enveloped him, complete, absolute. Harper sat in the blackness and listened to his own breathing. Above, muffled by earth and wood, he heard boots. Many boots, harsh Japanese voices, the sound of things being overturned, searched. The interrogation began. Even through the layers of earth, Harper could hear the Japanese soldiers shouting. The old farmer's voice responded, calm, deferential. The tone of a man who had survived occupation by knowing when to bow. The search seemed to last hours. Harper remained absolutely still, controlling his breathing, fighting the urge to shift position as his muscles cramped. One sound, one cough, one scrape of boot against earth, that's all it would take. Finally, the Japanese voices faded. The trucks drove away, but the trapdoor didn't open. Harper waited in the darkness, his mind racing. Had the family been arrested? Were Japanese soldiers waiting in silence above, hoping he'd reveal himself? Hours passed, maybe 6, maybe 8. Time lost meaning in the absolute darkness. Then finally, the sound of movement above. The grain containers being shifted, the trapdoor creaking open. Dim evening light flooded down. The old farmer's face appeared, silhouetted against the sky. He lowered a rope. Harper climbed up into the courtyard, his legs shaking from hours of immobility. The family gathered around him. The woman brought rice and vegetables, hot tea. The younger man gestured for Harper to eat quickly. They were taking an enormous risk, even allowing him above ground. As Harper ate, he tried to communicate. He pointed to himself. Daniel. He pointed to the sky, mimicked an airplane. They nodded. They understood he was American, a flyer. But why were they helping him? Harper gestured the question as best he could. Why risk this? The old farmer disappeared into the house and returned with something that made Harper's breath catch. A photograph, faded, creased. It showed a white man in missionary clothes standing with a group of Chinese villagers. The man was smiling, his arm around the shoulder of a younger version of the old farmer now standing before Harper. The farmer pointed to the missionary, then to Harper, then to himself. He made a gesture of eating, of hunger, then of plenty. The woman spoke rapidly, and though Harper couldn't understand the words, he understood the emotion. Gratitude. Deep, profound gratitude. Through gestures and crude drawings scratched in the dirt, the story emerged over the following days. In 1935, a devastating drought had struck this region of Manchuria. Crops failed. Famine spread. The Japanese occupiers offered no aid. People began to starve. An American missionary named Robert Chen had arrived with grain purchased from his mission's emergency funds. He had stayed for months, organizing food distribution, teaching farming techniques to maximize yield from poor soil, drilling a well that still provided water to the village. He had saved dozens of lives, including the lives of this family's two youngest children. The old farmer drew figures in the dirt, two small ones, his sons, saved by the American missionary. Then the farmer's expression darkened. He drew two more figures and crossed them out. Those same sons, now grown, killed by Japanese forces 3 years ago, executed for minor resistance activities. The family had lost everything to the occupation. Everything except their memory of the American who had shown them kindness when they were dying. Now, another American had fallen from the sky. The family saw it as providence, a chance to repay the debt, a way to honor the memory of the missionary and their lost sons. Harper tried to explain that this was different, that hiding him could get them all killed, that the debt was already paid. The old farmer shook his head firmly. In his culture, in his understanding of honor and obligation, the debt could never be fully repaid, but it could be honored, and honor demanded that they protect Harper, no matter the cost. So began 19 days in the grain pit. Harper would spend most of each day in the darkness below ground. The family established a routine. Before dawn, the old farmer would open the trapdoor and lower food and water. Harper would have a few minutes above ground to stretch, to breathe fresh air, to maintain his sanity. Then back into the pit before the village stirred and curious eyes might see. The family continued their normal routines, working the fields, interacting with neighbors, attending the mandatory gatherings where Japanese officials delivered propaganda and warnings, all while an American airman hid beneath their grain storage. The psychological toll was immense. Harper had been trained for combat, for radio operations, for emergency procedures. He had not been trained to sit in absolute darkness for 20 hours a day, not knowing if each moment would be his last. The cramped space made sleep difficult. His muscles atrophied. His mind began playing tricks. In the darkness, he would hear sounds that weren't there, footsteps, voices, the click of rifle bolts. Several times he nearly called out, convinced that Japanese soldiers had discovered him and were waiting above. But each time, when the trapdoor finally opened, it was only the old farmer with food and a reassuring nod. On the 5th day, Harper heard trucks again, more searches. This time, the Japanese were systematic. They were checking every building, every storage area, every possible hiding place. Harper heard them enter the courtyard above, heard the sharp commands, heard the family responding with practiced deference. Then he heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of grain containers being moved. They were checking the storage area. Harper pressed himself against the earthen wall of the pit, making himself as small as possible. Above, he heard a Japanese soldier speaking. The trapdoor was directly above him. If they opened it, he was dead. The family was dead. But the soldier didn't open it. Instead, Harper heard a different sound, the old farmer speaking rapidly. Then laughter, Japanese laughter. The soldier was laughing. The sounds moved away. The search continued in other parts of the compound, but they didn't return to the grain storage. Later, when Harper was finally allowed up, he demanded to know what had happened. How had the farmer stopped them from opening the trapdoor? Through gestures, the old man explained. He had told the Japanese soldier that the grain storage was contaminated, that his family had been suffering from dysentery, that they had been using the area to store soiled materials. The soldier, disgusted, had moved on without checking. It was a brilliant lie, and an incredibly risky one. If the soldier had been more thorough, if he had demanded proof, the deception would have been exposed. But the farmer had understood human nature. Soldiers, even occupying soldiers, would avoid contamination if given a reason. On the 8th day, the younger man brought news. He had heard from travelers that Soviet forces were advancing rapidly through Manchuria. The Red Army had entered the war against Japan on August 9th, just days before Harper's crash. Now they were pushing south, overwhelming Japanese positions. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. But that made Harper's situation more dangerous, not less. Desperate Japanese forces were becoming more brutal. Summary executions of prisoners. Scorched earth tactics. The family knew that as Japanese control collapsed, the occupiers might lash out at anyone suspected of collaboration. Yet they continued to hide Harper. On the 11th day, Harper heard screaming from somewhere in the village. It went on for hours. When the old farmer came that evening, his face was ashen. Through gestures, he explained what had happened. Japanese soldiers had discovered that a family 3 compounds away had been hiding food from the mandatory requisitions. The punishment had been swift and public. The father had been beaten to death in the village square. The mother and children had been forced to watch. It was a message: obey or die. Harper insisted that he should leave, that he should take his chances in the countryside, that he couldn't let this family risk the same fate. The old woman became angry. It was the first time Harper had seen her show any emotion other than quiet determination. She spoke rapidly, forcefully, jabbing her finger at the photograph of the missionary. The younger man translated through gestures. The missionary had not abandoned them when staying was dangerous. He had remained through the famine, through the early days of Japanese occupation, until his mission had finally ordered him to evacuate. The family would not abandon Harper. To do so would dishonor the memory of the man who had saved them. It would dishonor their dead sons. It would dishonor everything they believed about human obligation. Harper sat in the courtyard that evening, looking at the photograph of Robert Chen, the missionary he'd never met. The man was smiling in the picture, surrounded by grateful villagers. He had probably never imagined that his act of charity in 1935 would save an American pilot's life a decade later. He had probably never calculated the long-term consequences of his compassion. He had simply seen people suffering and had helped. Now, that help was echoing forward through time, creating ripples of protection and sacrifice that defied the brutal logic of war. On the 14th day, the sounds of artillery became audible in the distance. Soviet forces were getting closer. The Japanese were retreating but slowly, fighting delaying actions. The village existed in a strange limbo, still under nominal Japanese control but knowing that control was slipping away. Rumors spread. The emperor was going to surrender. No, the emperor would never surrender. Japan would fight to the last man. No, Japan was already negotiating. In the chaos of collapsing authority, anything seemed possible. Harper's family of protectors became more nervous. The younger man explained through gestures that retreating Japanese soldiers were more dangerous than occupying ones. Discipline was breaking down. Some units were committing atrocities as they withdrew. If they discovered Harper now, in the final days of the war, there would be no mercy. On the 17th day, the old farmer came to the pit in the middle of the day. This was unprecedented. Harper climbed out to find the entire family gathered. The old man was holding a piece of paper, a leaflet dropped by Soviet aircraft. It was in Russian and Chinese. The younger man, who had some education, translated the Chinese characters through gestures and drawings. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration on August 15th. It was now August 17th. The surrender was official. Harper felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked him down. Relief, joy, disbelief. He had survived. Against all odds, hidden in a grain pit by strangers who owed him nothing, he had survived. But the family's celebration was muted. The old farmer pointed toward the horizon. Japanese soldiers were still in the area. The surrender had been announced, but not all units had received orders. Some were still fighting. Some were in chaos. Some were simply trying to escape before Soviet forces arrived. It was still dangerous. They would wait one more day. On the 18th day they heard gunfire, close, very close. Harper was in the pit when it started. Above he heard shouting, running feet, the distinctive crack of rifles, the heavier sound of a machine gun. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted maybe 20 minutes. Then silence. Harper waited in the darkness, his heart pounding. Hours passed. No one came to open the trapdoor. Night fell, still nothing. Harper's mind raced with terrible possibilities. The family had been killed. Japanese soldiers had occupied the compound. He was trapped. He would die down here in this earthen hole just days after the war had ended. Then, finally, movement above. The trapdoor opened, but it wasn't the old farmer's face that appeared. It was a Soviet soldier, young, wearing the uniform of the Red Army. He shouted something in Russian. Harper raised his hands and called out in English, "American, U.S. Army Air Forces." The Soviet soldier's expression changed from suspicion to surprise. He called to others. More Soviet faces appeared above the pit. They lowered a ladder. Harper climbed up into a courtyard that looked like it had been searched but not destroyed. The Soviet soldiers were speaking rapidly. One of them, an officer, spoke some English. He explained that they had swept through the village an hour ago. There had been a brief firefight with a Japanese rear guard. The Japanese had retreated. The village was now under Soviet control. Where was the family? Harper demanded to know. Where were the people who lived here? The Soviet officer looked uncomfortable. He led Harper through the compound. In the main room of the house, Harper found them. The old farmer, his wife, their son. They were huddled together, terrified. When they saw Harper, relief flooded their faces. The Soviet soldiers had frightened them. The family had hidden when the shooting started, not knowing who would emerge victorious. They had been unable to reach Harper, unable to open the trapdoor with Soviet troops in the compound. But they were alive, all of them. They had survived. Harper tried to explain to the Soviet officer what this family had done. How they had hidden him for 19 days. How they had risked everything. The officer listened, then spoke to the family in Chinese. The old farmer responded quietly. The officer translated. The farmer was saying that they had done only what honor required, that the debt to the American missionary could never be fully repaid, that protecting Harper had been their duty and their privilege. Harper spent one more night in the compound. Not in the pit. In the house, as a guest. The family shared what little food they had. The Soviet officer arranged for Harper to be transported to a collection point for Allied personnel the next morning. That final evening, Harper sat with the family in their courtyard. The younger man had found a piece of charcoal and paper. Harper drew a map of the United States. He marked Nebraska, where he was from. He drew his family, his parents, his sister. He tried to explain that he would tell them about this Chinese family, that he would never forget. The old farmer brought out the photograph of Robert Chen again. Through the younger man's limited translation and gestures, Harper finally understood the full story. Chen had not just brought food during the famine. He had stayed for 2 years. He had learned Chinese. He had become part of the community. He had delivered the old farmer's youngest son when complications during birth threatened both mother and child. He had taught the village children to read. He had been, in every meaningful way, their salvation. When the Japanese occupation had intensified in 1937, Chen's mission had ordered all American personnel to evacuate. Chen had not wanted to leave. The villagers had begged him to stay, but he had finally departed, promising to return when it was safe. He never did. The family had later heard that Chen had died in 1941 in the Philippines, killed during the Japanese invasion. The man who had saved their village had himself been killed by the same forces that now occupied their land. For the family, protecting Harper was more than repaying a debt. It was a way of keeping Chen's spirit alive. It was a way of saying that his kindness had not been in vain. That compassion could echo through time. That one act of humanity could inspire others, even across years and cultures and the chaos of war. Harper left the next morning in a Soviet truck. As they drove away, he looked back at the compound. The family stood in the courtyard waving, the old farmer, his wife, their son. 3 people who had defied occupation, risked annihilation, and preserved their honor by protecting a stranger. Harper would make it back to American lines within a week. He would be debriefed, processed, and eventually sent home. He would return to Nebraska, to his family, to a country celebrating victory. But he would carry with him the weight of what he had experienced. The knowledge that his survival had not been the result of military might or strategic planning. It had been the result of an American missionary's compassion in 1935. A compassion so profound that it had created a debt of honor strong enough to transcend war, occupation, and the threat of death. In his official report, Harper documented everything: the crash, the family, the 19 days in the grain pit, the connection to Robert Chen. Military intelligence filed the report and moved on. There were thousands of such stories in the closing days of the war, but Harper never moved on. He spent years trying to locate the family after the war. Manchuria had become part of communist China. Communication was impossible. He wrote letters to missionary organizations, trying to find information about Robert Chen, trying to understand more about the man whose legacy had saved his life. He found some records. Chen had indeed been a missionary in Manchuria from 1933 to 1937. He had worked with farming communities. He had been known for his dedication and his refusal to abandon his post even as conditions deteriorated. He had evacuated to the Philippines in 1938 and had died there in 1941, killed by Japanese forces during their invasion. Chen had never married. He had no children. His legacy was the lives he had touched in a remote corner of Manchuria, lives that had, in turn, touched Harper. In 1972, as relations between the United States and China began to thaw, Harper made one more attempt to locate the family. He wrote to Chinese authorities, explaining what had happened, asking if they could help him find the people who had saved him. He never received a response. Harper died in 1989, never knowing what became of the old farmer, his wife, or their son. Never knowing if they had survived the chaos of post-war China, the communist revolution, the cultural revolution. Never able to thank them one more time. But the story survived. Harper had told it to his children, to his grandchildren. He had spoken about it at veterans' gatherings, at schools, anywhere people would listen. He wanted the world to know what ordinary people were capable of, what honor and compassion could achieve, even in the darkest circumstances. The story of the grain pit became a testament to something larger than military strategy or national conflict. It became a story about the invisible threads that connect human beings across cultures and time, about how one act of kindness can ripple forward, creating consequences that no one could predict. Robert Chen had saved a village from famine in 1935. That village had saved Daniel Harper in 1945, and Harper had spent the rest of his life telling their story, ensuring that the chain of compassion would continue. In the vast machinery of World War II, with its millions of casualties and its grand strategic movements, the story of a radio man in a grain pit seems small. But it is in these small stories that the true nature of humanity reveals itself. Not in the great battles or the famous generals, but in the quiet courage of a farming family who risked everything for a stranger. Because they remembered when a stranger had risked everything for them, the war ended, empires fell, borders changed, but the memory of compassion, the weight of honor, the power of human connection, these things endured. In a grain pit in Manchuria, in the darkness beneath enemy occupation, these things had been enough to save a life. And in the end, perhaps that is the only victory that truly matters.